This video is sponsored by Patreon. My Patreon. Growing up, were you ever told that watching too much TV would give you square eyes? No? Only me? Never mind then. But the concept of TV bad has been around for a very long time. So much so that an entire Doctor Who episode was written about it. After contributing The Unquiet Dead to Doctor Who's 2005 Series 1, writer Mark Gatiss was keen to return for Series 2, this time challenged by showrunner Russell T Davies to write a story called Mr. Sandman, about a contagious song containing an alien signal that turns people into faceless monsters. Davies later changed this idea, but if it sounds familiar, that's because it is. Gatiss still wrote it, if only almost a decade later. Instead of the song, it was decided that the story would centre around televisions in the 1950s. This resulted in The Idiot's Lantern, an episode with a title much better than it deserves. This episode takes the Doctor and Rose to 1953 London, where an alien inside TV screens is trying to steal people's faces during the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. But is this episode good enough to glue you to the screen? The Idiot's Lantern is set in the 1950s, which I find is an interesting setting because it's more recent than most stories set in the past. It creates a similar effect to Father's Day in Series 1, with a strange sense of familiarity yet difference. The Doctor and Rose rock up in the TARDIS. No, literally. They come out dressed up all ready to see Elvis perform in New York, and they even have a cute little moped, but it turns out the TARDIS has taken them somewhere completely different, in classic Doctor Who fashion. They got the year right this time, but they're actually in 1953 London.
Wow, this could still be New York. I mean, this looks very New York to me. London in New York, man.
The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II is a creative setting since it's quite unconventional and not something that immediately jumps out at you. It's a good time period to explore because the coronation came at a time when the country was still recovering from World War II, and it brought a lot of people together. The coronation was a huge event and roughly 27 million people came together to watch it live on TV. It basically made television a thing, since people were so used to radio that the television industry was still only just starting out. I like how the episode shows this, with Mr. Magpie about to go out of business and the Connolly family unsure of whether a TV is worth buying. In concept, I like the use of television as a villain. Since it was a relatively new piece of technology, there are a lot of fears and scaremongering around it, so it makes perfect sense to turn these fears into a Doctor Who monster, a good way to present technological fears of the time.
I heard they rot your brains, rot them into soup, and your brain comes pouring out of your ears. That's what television does.
However, in practice, the Wire kind of gets lost in translation. The Wire is an alien lifeform executed by its own people, but managed to escape to Earth, taking the form of a TV presenter on the screen. The Wire forces Mr. Magpie to do her bidding, basically reenacting Little Shop of Horrors.
I'm just a mean green mother from outer space and I'm bad.
As Magpie sells more TVs, the Wire becomes part of more and more households, stealing people's faces to keep herself fed, as she is insistent on constantly telling you.
I'm the Wire, and I'm hungry.
The whole stealing faces thing is a great basic idea, and the faceless people are creepy enough, but the episode doesn't really explain how any of it works. People need mouths and noses to breathe, yet the people who lose their faces to the Wire are shown to still be alive, which doesn't really make much sense at all. Everything about the Wire seems very surface level, like a basic idea of a villain without the stuffing to make them interesting. Funnily enough, this is one of those Doctor Who episodes where you care less about the big scary monster of the week, and more about the human heart of the story. This heart comes in the form of the Connolly family, who are one of the main features of the story, with a very soap opera style subplot about family drama. And the soap opera atmosphere is definitely intentional, since the street the episode takes place on is called Florizel Street, which was the working title of Coronation Street. Gatiss clearly wanted to pay homage to the well-known waste of a TV slot. The Connolly family patriarch Eddie is a World War II veteran who takes great pride in the time he spent serving the country. However, this service has caused him to instill an almost militaristic discipline within the household, ruling by fear and being heavily controlling. He very much lives in the past, since he hasn't known any different. His son Tommy wants to go to college, but Eddie simply cannot comprehend a life that isn't manual labour, because that's what he's used to. The family dynamic throughout is really good, and I think it does a good job showing the shift in culture and society after the war.
New monarch, new age, new world. No room for a man like Eddie Connolly.
For the time period, Eddie isn't really doing anything unexpected or looked down upon. It was just society at the time.
Eddie, you want to beat that out of him?
That's exactly what I'm gonna...
The fact that he's still an upstanding, patriotic and respected citizen really hammers home the views of the time. It all leads to a really good line where Tommy rightfully brings up how Eddie had fought a war to stop fascism, but has himself instilled it in a way in their own household.
Don't get it, do you? You fought against fascism, remember? You were fighting so that little twerps like me could do what we want, say what we want.
Even though The Wire is a weak villain in practice, I like the build up to the mystery of people being bundled into mysterious black cars, and the Connolly family's grandmother being locked away in her room making thumps and thuds upstairs. It creates a very sinister atmosphere that matches the 1950s and 60s sci-fi horror from series like Tales of Tomorrow and The Twilight Zone. We follow the Doctor and Rose as they explore these strange goings on in the neighbourhood, and end up crossing paths with the police and Torchwood, providing some nice continuity to the wider Series 2 story arc, by showing Torchwood's ongoing presence. There is a nice detective element to it all, with the Doctor doing a Sherlock and deducing things by reading people and his surroundings. It's a good part of the episode. I like that Rose plays a central role in this investigation, picking up on the Magpie Electrical's lead of her own accord. It gives her a good moment of independence, which she sorely lacks during Series 2. However, this sadly comes crashing down when she confronts Mr. Magpie and gets her face snatched, disappearing from the rest of the story. Well, thanks for coming, Rose. Rose's face getting sucked off gives us a good look at the 10th Doctor on his own with nothing to lose, since he's probably annoyed he wasn't the one sucking her face. Tennant is great throughout this episode, getting to show the darker, angrier side of his usually upbeat and excited incarnation. Early on, he shouts in the face of Mr. Connolly to shut him up, and he later blows up in the face of Detective Inspector Bishop after finding out Rose has lost her face.
No. Because now, Detective Inspector Bishop, there is no power on this earth that can stop.
On one hand, it's great to see the 10th Doctor angry because it shows how protective he is of Rose and the lengths he'll go to in order to protect her. But on the other hand, the side characters like the Detective Inspector just kind of fall to the wayside in this story. The Detective Inspector is a boring and undeveloped character that doesn't really make you feel any empathy for their situation. It's a shame, since he could have been a Jago or Lightfoot type supporting character, but they don't even try. All he is a narrative tool to move the story along a bit, before vanishing into the ether without really contributing all that much, since it's actually Tommy who plays a part in the climax. The Wire's ultimate plan is to use the transmitter at Alexandra Palace as a retriever to steal the faces of everyone watching the coronation on TV. And remember, that's like 27 million of them, so the Wire ain't going hungry for a long time. I do like the visual of the families having their faces sucked into the TV, especially because it uses the established Connolly family as a focus, so we have a personal anchor to the threat. However, the climax falls short, with the Doctor climbing up a big mast chasing Mr. Magpie, and Tommy not really doing much but changing a fuse to trap the Wire in a Betamax tape. You kind of sit there thinking, wait, that was it? All of that and that's how that ends? What was the point? At least you know the Wire is trapped forever because nobody cared about Betamax. Even though the climax is a letdown, the actual ending is really good and touching. The Doctor and Rose become one of the thousands of street parties to mark the occasion of the coronation. And this isn't pseudo-history, this actually happened across the country. As the Doctor says,
This is history, right?
This ending scene also gives some closure to the Connolly family drama, rather than doing it soap opera style and making you wait weeks before bringing someone back from the dead 2 months later and starting it all over again. Earlier in the story, Mr. Connolly called the police on his wife's mother, since she had her face stolen. This makes Mrs. Connolly kick him out of the house, and at the end of the story he packs his things up and leaves for good. I like how Tommy is initially trying to be stubborn and say his dad deserved it, but Rose and the doctor change his mind and convince him to go and walk his dad to the station if nothing else. It's a hopeful, heartwarming look towards the future, much like the coronation and the street parties themselves. It's just a small moment, a little gesture that means so much and leaves the story on such a happy note. I'm just gonna take a minute to address the elephant in the room. The Idiot's Lantern is a Mark Gatiss episode. It's literally the definition of a Mark Gatiss episode. It's not even one of his sneakily good or experimental Moffat era ones like Night Terrors or Sleep No More. It's just a plain old Gatiss episode. It's perfectly mediocre in every way. There are some good parts, but not much really goes anywhere. It's one of those inconsequential episodes that you don't want to rewatch, but when you do, you can have a good time if you just want a low stakes episode to put on during lunch or something. Nothing too heavy or involved. But on the flip side, it's absolutely not an episode you want to show someone who isn't already super into Doctor Who because of the over-the-top villain. Maureen Lipman is well cast, but she's wasted in the role and has to play a very grating and unbearable villain. And sure, an unbearable villain can sometimes be okay, but you don't want to make him as unbearable as The Wire is. It's just such a mediocre and uneventful episode you really have to be in a certain mood to want to watch. Overall, The Idiot's Lantern is a weird episode to review, because it's an episode better suited to being on in the background, rather than an episode to break down and explore in depth with critical analysis. It's so easy to criticise when you want to review it, and that makes it seem worse than it is. There are a lot of redeeming qualities about it, like the interesting setting, which provides a good backdrop to explorations of technological fear, along with nostalgia for the good old days, when times have actually moved on. The Wire is insufferable and the side characters are boring, so it's a weird episode to rank. I think I would give it a C on the Series 2 tier list, because you can enjoy it under the right circumstances, but those circumstances are pretty much not actually watching the episode as it is intended. The plot is generic, but the setting saves it, with the interesting mystery setup, and the Doctor and Rose dressing up to match their surroundings, even if they're completely off course from where they planned on going to. The storyline with Mr. Connolly is one of the highlights because it manages to tackle the ingrained attitudes of the time, along with the important issue of controlling and abusive relationships. There are great themes woven throughout, but Gatiss's writing style just doesn't make everything shine or come to life as it should have, which is a huge shame, and it definitely isn't helped by the fact that filming schedules were changed around, resulting in him having to rush the script. But hey, at least it gave us the recurring Easter egg of Magpie Electronics. But to be honest, that's probably the biggest impact this episode ever had, and I think that goes to show just how average it is. I'd like to give a special shout out to my gold level patron, Steph McNevin Miller. Thank you for your support.